France, 1918. A young Douglas MacArthur walks directly toward German machine guns with no weapon in his hands. Bullets are tearing through the air around him. His men are pinned down in trenches, watching their commander do something that looks like suicide. And George Patton, who would become one of America's most famous generals, sees this moment and says something that reveals the thin line between courage and insanity. This isn't mythology or propaganda. This actually happened, and multiple witnesses documented it. MacArthur charged enemy positions unarmed not once, but repeatedly during World War I. What Patton said about these actions and what they reveal about both men defines the paradox of military leadership. Was MacArthur the bravest officer in the American Army, or was he recklessly gambling with his life to build a reputation? The answer matters because these two men would shape how America fought its wars for the next 3 decades. Douglas MacArthur arrives in France in 1917 as a brigadier general commanding the 42nd Rainbow Division. He's young for the rank, aristocratic, and intensely ambitious. But what makes him immediately notorious among American forces is his bizarre approach to combat. MacArthur refuses to wear a standard helmet, instead wearing a crushed cap. He refuses to carry a gas mask, despite the prevalence of chemical weapons. And most shockingly, he refuses to carry a weapon into battle. His explanation is that an officer's job is to lead, not to shoot. He argues that carrying a rifle or pistol is a distraction from command responsibilities. He believes that an officer who is focused on his own weapon is not properly focused on directing his men. This sounds noble in theory, but in practice it means MacArthur walks into machine gun fire with nothing but a riding crop or swagger stick in his hands. His staff thinks he has a death wish. His superiors think he's grandstanding. His men don't know whether to be inspired or terrified. The first time Patton hears about MacArthur's behavior, his reaction is skeptical. Patton himself is building a reputation for personal bravery, leading tank attacks and exposing himself to fire. But Patton always goes into combat fully armed, ready to fight personally if necessary. He views combat as visceral and personal. The idea of walking into battle unarmed strikes him as either theatrical posturing or genuine madness. He needs to see it for himself to understand what MacArthur is actually doing. The opportunity comes during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the fall of 1918. This is the largest American battle of World War I, with over 1 million American troops engaged. MacArthur's division is attacking heavily fortified German positions. The fighting is brutal, with German machine guns creating killing zones that stop American advances cold. Units are taking horrific casualties just trying to cross open ground. And this is where MacArthur does something that becomes legendary and controversial in equal measure. MacArthur's men are pinned down by concentrated machine gun fire from a German strongpoint. The position has to be taken or the entire offensive will stall. Men are dying in the attempt. Officers are calling for artillery support or proposing flanking maneuvers. But MacArthur has a different idea. He announces he will personally lead an assault on the position. And when he steps out of the relative safety of the American lines, he is carrying no weapon, just his riding crop, walking upright, directly toward the machine guns. What happens next is documented by multiple witnesses and later becomes part of both MacArthur's legend and the debate about his leadership style. MacArthur walks toward the German machine gun nest at a steady pace, not running, not taking cover, just walking as if he's on a parade ground. Bullets are hitting the ground around him. Men to his left and right are falling. The sound of machine gun fire is deafening, and MacArthur keeps walking. His theory, which he later explains, is that machine gun fire is less accurate than soldiers believe. The guns spray bullets in a pattern, and if you understand the pattern, you can walk through it. He also believes that his men will not follow him if he shows fear by running or ducking. He thinks that visible courage, demonstrated through calm movement under fire, is the most effective form of leadership in combat. Whether this theory is brilliant or insane depends on whether it works. The German machine gunners are firing directly at him. They can see this American officer walking toward them unarmed. It must seem surreal. According to some accounts, the Germans are so shocked by what they're seeing that their fire becomes less effective because they're not believing what they're witnessing. MacArthur later claims that the psychological effect of walking calmly under fire is greater than any tactical maneuver. He argues that it breaks the enemy's mental state while inspiring your own men. Behind MacArthur, American soldiers are watching their commander do something that looks impossible. The machine guns haven't killed him yet. He's still walking, And gradually, inspired or shamed or simply unable to let their commander go forward alone, American troops begin to advance behind him. They're moving faster than MacArthur, taking cover when they can, but they're moving forward when moments before they were pinned down. MacArthur's unarmed walk is somehow breaking the deadlock. The German position is eventually overrun. MacArthur reaches it, still alive and unwounded. His men take the position with bayonets and grenades. The attack succeeds, and MacArthur has done exactly what he set out to do. He led from the front in a way that was undeniable and visible to every soldier who witnessed it. But the cost calculation is complicated. Other officers died attempting similar advances. MacArthur survived partly through luck, partly through his theory about machine gun fire patterns, and partly through the psychological effect he created. The question is whether this kind of leadership is sustainable or simply a gamble that eventually runs out. George Patton hears the detailed accounts of MacArthur's charge, and his reaction is complex. Patton respects personal courage above almost any other military virtue. He believes officers must lead from the front and share the risks they ask their men to take. In this sense, MacArthur's actions align with Patton's values. But Patton also believes in the practical application of violence. He thinks an officer should be the deadliest man in his unit, not the most theatrical. What Patton reportedly says about MacArthur's unarmed charges captures this tension. According to multiple historical sources, Patton acknowledges that MacArthur has more balls than brains, but admits that the approach works. Patton's assessment is that MacArthur is gambling with his life in a way that's both courageous and foolish, but that the psychological impact on both American and German troops creates a real tactical advantage. Patton can't decide if MacArthur is a genius or just incredibly lucky. The deeper issue Patton identifies is whether MacArthur's courage is genuine or performative. Patton himself takes enormous risks in combat, but always while armed and ready to personally kill enemy soldiers. He leads tank charges, walks through artillery fire to rally troops, and deliberately exposes himself to danger. But Patton does this because he believes in personal combat and wants to kill the enemy himself. MacArthur's unarmed approach suggests something different, a calculated use of personal risk as a leadership tool rather than as a means to directly engage in combat. Patton concludes that MacArthur's method is effective but not replicable. It works for MacArthur because of his personality, his timing, and his willingness to accept the very real possibility of death. But Patton doubts that other officers could or should try to copy it. The problem is that MacArthur's survival requires a combination of tactical understanding, psychological insight, and pure luck. If any element fails, the officer dies pointlessly. Patton respects what MacArthur accomplished, but thinks it's a dangerous model for leadership. What makes Patton's assessment significant is that both men are trying to solve the same problem. How do you lead men who are terrified and facing death? Patton's answer is to be the most aggressive, most violent, most personally dangerous officer in the Army, leading through intimidation and personal example of combat effectiveness. MacArthur's answer is to demonstrate such complete disregard for personal safety that men feel compelled to match his courage. Both approaches work. Both are dangerous. And both reveal as much about the officer's psychology as about military tactics. The relationship between Patton and MacArthur remains complicated throughout their careers. They respect each other's combat records but maintain distance because their styles are so different. Patton thinks MacArthur is too theatrical. MacArthur thinks Patton is too crude. But both recognize that the other has discovered something true about leadership under fire. Men will follow someone who demonstrates courage in a way they cannot ignore. The method differs, but the principle is the same. MacArthur's unarmed charges during World War I earn him an extraordinary collection of medals. He receives 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 7 Silver Stars, and multiple other decorations. He becomes one of the most decorated American officers of the war. But the citations for these medals reveal something interesting. Many of them acknowledge not just courage, but the specific act of leading advances without personal weapons, purely through example. The military is officially recognizing that MacArthur has discovered a form of leadership that works, even if it seems insane. But there's a cost that's less discussed. MacArthur's approach creates enormous pressure on other officers to match his visible courage. Junior officers feel they cannot show fear or caution when their commanding general is walking unarmed through machine gun fire. This raises standards for courage, but it also leads to unnecessary casualties among officers trying to live up to MacArthur's example without his particular combination of skills and luck. Some historians argue that MacArthur's theatrical bravery indirectly kills subordinates who feel compelled to take similar risks. The psychological impact on MacArthur himself is also significant. He survives World War I convinced that he is somehow protected or destined for greater things. This belief shapes his entire subsequent career. In World War II and Korea, MacArthur continues to expose himself to danger in ways that terrify his staff, but reinforce his self-image as someone who cannot be killed in combat. The unarmed charges in France become the foundation for a personal mythology that MacArthur never questions. Patton watches MacArthur's career progress and sees both the benefits and the dangers of this mythology. The benefits are undeniable. MacArthur's reputation for personal courage gives him enormous moral authority with troops. Soldiers will attempt difficult missions for MacArthur because they know he has proven willing to share their risks. But the danger is that MacArthur begins to believe he is invulnerable, which leads to strategic overconfidence. The same fearlessness that makes him effective in tactical situations makes him reckless in strategic planning. The unarmed charges in World War I establish a pattern that defines MacArthur's entire career. He makes bold decisions that seem impossible, backs them with personal example, and often succeeds through a combination of careful calculation and willingness to risk everything. But when this approach fails, as it eventually does in Korea, the failures are catastrophic precisely because MacArthur has never learned to moderate his risk-taking. Patton's early assessment proves prophetic. MacArthur's courage is real and effective, but it's also unsustainable and ultimately dangerous. What Patton said about MacArthur charging machine guns unarmed captures something fundamental about military leadership. Courage can be both genuine and theatrical, effective and dangerous, admirable and foolish. MacArthur's World War I actions were objectively insane by any rational calculation. Walking toward machine guns without a weapon should result in death. That MacArthur survived and succeeded doesn't make the approach sensible. It makes him either extraordinarily lucky or somehow able to calculate odds that others cannot see. Patton's own approach to courage was different, but equally extreme. He believed in personal violence and wanted to kill enemy soldiers with his own hands. His leadership style was built on being the most dangerous man in any room. Where MacArthur led through theatrical displays of fearlessness, Patton led through aggressive participation in combat. Both men were trying to inspire troops through personal example, but the nature of that example differed fundamentally. The historical verdict on MacArthur's unarmed charges is mixed. Military historians acknowledge they were effective in context, but warn against treating them as a model for leadership. The specific circumstances of World War I trench warfare, MacArthur's understanding of machine gun fire patterns, and the psychological state of soldiers in that particular conflict created conditions where his approach worked. But those conditions don't generalize. In different circumstances, the same actions would simply get officers killed without accomplishing anything. What makes the story relevant beyond military history is what it reveals about risk and leadership. MacArthur understood that sometimes the most effective action is the one that seems most irrational. Walking unarmed toward machine guns created a psychological impact that conventional tactics could not match. But this only works if you survive. The same action would be remembered as pointless suicide if MacArthur had been killed. The line between genius and madness often depends entirely on outcomes. Patton's assessment that MacArthur had more balls than brains was both a compliment and a warning. It acknowledged extraordinary courage while questioning whether that courage served rational military objectives. Patton could never fully endorse MacArthur's methods because Patton believed war was about killing the enemy efficiently, not about personal demonstrations of fearlessness. But he couldn't dismiss MacArthur either, because the results spoke for themselves. MacArthur's unarmed charges worked, and in war, what works demands respect regardless of how insane it appears. The ultimate lesson is that leadership in extreme circumstances requires actions that seem irrational from a distance. MacArthur's unarmed walks through machine gun fire made no sense to anyone who wasn't there. But to the men pinned down in trenches, watching their commander do something impossible, it created a moment when the impossible became possible. That's what leadership sometimes requires. Being willing to do what seems insane to prove that courage can overcome firepower. Whether that's brilliance or madness depends on whether you survive to tell the story. What Patton said when MacArthur charged machine guns unarmed was more than commentary on one man's courage. It was an assessment of the paradox at the heart of military leadership, that inspiring men to face death sometimes requires demonstrating a willingness to die that looks indistinguishable from suicidal recklessness. MacArthur survived his unarmed charges through calculation, luck, and perhaps something neither he nor anyone else fully understood. Patton recognized both the effectiveness and the danger of this approach. The story reminds us that leadership in extreme circumstances often requires actions that make no sense to observers, but change everything for those who witness them directly. Sometimes courage and madness are separated only by outcomes, and history judges the difference based on who survives to write the story. If you found this exploration of courage, risk, and the thin line between genius and madness compelling, consider subscribing for more deep dives into history's most extraordinary military moments.